Hey, I'm on now. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Now, I have something to tell everybody, and I'm curious if the three professional genealogists in this room even know what I'm going to tell them. When we asked Alec to speak, several months ago, I had no idea what national holiday was today. Alec, do you know what national holiday it is today?
Um, well, no. It's
Okay, you're going to be very surprised because today you're speaking about the Freedom of Information Acts, right?
yes.
Today is National Freedom of Information Day.
I think Sunshine Week does happen around now, so I guess that tracks. I didn't know there was a special day, but I could
So,
believe that.
so in your honor, without us even knowing it, you're going to be talking about all that today, and I thank you. And
Beautiful.
I thought that was pretty apropos. So anyway, I wanted to thank everybody for being here today. I'm the president of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Southwest Florida. And we have in this room here Howard Finkel, who is our program chair, and Jim Haberman, who takes care of all our tech stuff and puts together our website and helps set up the Zooms. And Liz Klaber here, who's our treasurer, and many of our members. And we've got a few professional genealogists who came to hear Alex speak. We have Suzanne Hoffman in here today. And we also have Janice Seller. So I thank you all for coming. And I'm going to turn over to speaking over to Howard Finkel, our program chair, to tell you about upcoming meetings and to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Kim, and welcome everyone. We have one more meeting after today, and that will be in April, on April 27th, and that will be at Aviva, where we meet in person. And Eric Wolfgang will be our speaker, and the topic will be the general use of geography in genealogy. So again, that will be April 27th.
What time?
At 1 o'clock. Today, Alec Ferretti is our presenter, and Alec is a New York City-based professional genealogist who has worked for the Wells Fargo Family and Business History Center, researching family histories for high net worth clients. Alec specializes in genealogy of 20th century immigrants to the United States. He is a regular lecturer at genealogical societies and conferences. He serves as the president of the New York Genealogy and Technology Group, serves actively on the board of directors of the Association of Professional Genealogists, and on the board of Reclaim the Records, a nonprofit dedicated to wrangling public records from obstinate government agencies. Alec, you're on.
Hi, everyone. Okay, we all see my screen? So we are a small enough group that, if people have questions, we can somewhat try to do this. Although we are recording it. So Kim, would you rather hold questions till the end, or do you mind if it's a bit in the middle?
You could answer questions if somebody has them in the middle. Can you see everybody if they raise their hand, or
Somewhat. I'll do my best. I think if you raise their hand, it'll pop up to the front. So
okay.
I think that should work. Okay, let's go. So disclaimer time. I am not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. I do pretend to be a lawyer, but not really, because that'd be a felony. But I do act under the world of doing legal things. I'll put it that way. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so please don't take anything I say as legal advice. Also, as we just discussed, I am on the board of directors of Reclaim the Records. We are an official 501c3 organization, and our main activity is using public records laws to force government agencies to give us historic records. So that is what I do all day long. This is not a Reclaim the Records branded or themed talk, although obviously much of this content is related to what I do through my work for that organization. If you have questions about Reclaim the Records, we could always discuss that afterwards, but it is not really what we're here to talk about today specifically. Because today we're going to cover how you guys can make your own FOIA request for records. So that brings us to FOIA. In the words of the U.S. Court of Appeals in 1983, it has often been observed that the central purposes of the Freedom of Information Act is to open up the workings of government to public scrutiny. One of the premises of that objective is that the belief that an informed electorate is vital to the proper operation of a democracy. And that is how we get to where we are today. Democratic governments aspire to be transparent. And during the middle of the 20th century, many laws were passed at many levels of government to ensure that the public had access to government records. We are talking about the US here today, but most Western governments have laws of this nature in some way or another. And this is really important to genealogists because the vast majority of what we use are government records. Sometimes there's synagogue records, but basically everything that we need almost entirely comes from the government: the census, the ship manifests, birth certificates. They're all government records, and they're all laws that govern the access to these records. And as I'd imagine everybody here has experienced, we often have issues with gaining access to the records that we want or need for our research. Many genealogists, aka the WASPs, often are researching in a very different era than us Jews are. And there's a lot of overlap. But for the most part, the broader world of genealogy often looks to the 17th and 18th century. And the main records that people use from that era are things like court records, land records, things that have a long-standing common law tradition of becoming publicly available. So it's rare that a genealogist researching deeds in 1872 needs to cite public records laws to get access to deeds, because these have been historically public records everywhere, and you can go into the courthouse and look at them. But people who research the 20th century often run into a lot more roadblocks because the records that we need are often from more diverse government entities, and there's often privacy issues, or real or perceived. And all of this leads to us needing to understand how freedom of information laws work so we can use them to get the records that we desire. Okay, we need to briefly have a little civics lesson. I apologize for what may be obvious to some or all of you, but just to make sure we're on the same page. We have multiple branches of government for now, and we have the legislative branch, which is the part of the government that writes the laws, aka Congress. Then we have the executive branch, the part of the government that carries out the laws, aka the presidency and all of his agencies. Now, over the last 100 years, the legislature has delegated a lot of authority to the executive branch. So the executive branch functions in a lawmaking capacity in many ways. And there are still distinctions between the kinds of laws that are created by Congress and by agencies, namely that Congress passes statutes and agencies promulgate regulations. And regulations carry the force of law, but they cannot supersede a statute. So when Congress says do X, and you agency can interpret how that works, the agency does that, but they can't overstep what Congress said. And all that is to say that Congress passed the law called FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, that requires agencies from the executive branch to disclose any information requested by the public unless it falls under one of 9 exemptions. And it presumes that government records are public. And a record is basically anything with written material on it. Handwritten notes, a calendar, a database, an email. And agencies are required to provide these unless they're exempt, but they're not required to create records or to answer questions. And this is the framework that was created by our legislative branch, thankfully. And many of us have used FOIA before. Anybody who's ever gotten an SS5 from Social Security, that's the application for a Social Security number, has made a FOIA request. And in the case of SS5s, it's not very controversial. Social Security has a whole program to make these FOIA requests. They cost about $30, and in a couple of weeks, you'll get your SS5. Basically, anybody that had a Social Security number should have one of these forms, and they're great because it has your parents' names, your date of birth, your place of birth, etc. They cost $30, which is annoying, but there is a special law that allows Social Security to charge extra fees, so that's what they cost. And anyone who's done this has made a FOIA request. So congrats and welcome to the world of FOIA. For other kinds of requests, you can make requests from FOIA.gov, which is the general clearinghouse for agencies' FOIA requests. Not every agency is a part of this, but many of them are. And this, of course, just refers to the federal government. And basically, the way you can make a FOIA request, and of course, we'll go into more depth in a few slides, but on the most basic level, you make a request in writing to the agency. You say what you want. They could potentially send you a bill, but the first 100 pages and 2 hours of search time are free. And if you get a bill, you have to pay the fees for the copies or whatever, and then you'll get your records. Requesters are typically required to pay for the real cost of reproduction, although generally agencies waive the fees for smaller requests. And some agencies do have special authority to charge for extra expenses, like Social Security does. Now, there's one great thing in that in 2016, Congress amended FOIA to say that if an agency takes longer than 30 days to respond to a request, they almost can never charge you. And because the government is slow, you're basically always going to have to wait more than 30 days, which means virtually any FOIA request anyone ever submits will not have a fee assessment. I get into a world where I ask for crazy things where I do have to pay fees sometimes, but you guys will probably never, ever have to pay for a fee for anything, unless it's an SS5, because there's a special law about that. Now, this all sounds relatively simple, but of course, if it were, we wouldn't be here today. So, of course, the world of FOIA is an absolute mess. Many records that genealogists want are exempt through a FOIA provision, one of those exemptions, or through some other law. And on top of that, many times people who own records claim that certain records are exempt, even when they're actually not. And like any other law, FOIA is subjective. So there are general exemptions that are 2 lines of text each, and an agency can say, well, this information is exempt for this reason, and I can disagree with them and I can fight them on it, but only a judge can make a conclusive decision about what is or is not public. And it's why we claim the records exist, because we sue agencies for historic records and make a judge decide if what we want is public or not. So just to run through the exemptions, we have B1, classified information, B2, personnel rules, B3, information exempted by another law, B4, trade secrets, B5, interagency communication or deliberative process, B6, personal privacy, B7, law enforcement, B8, financial institutions, and my personal favorite, B9, the information on geological information on wells. So some of these have almost no relevance to genealogists. I have never been B9. It is my goal to one day get B9. But the main ones that we care about would be B3, B6, and B7. So we can't get information under FOIA if it's not public by some other law, if there's a personal privacy concern, or if it's related to law enforcement. Those are really the only times that we are going to have to deal with FOIA exemptions. Because a lot of what we want might be like FBI records or just people's historic records that obviously could have a privacy interest, or if there's just some law banning access to them. Now, if you remember before, I explained how Congress passes laws and agencies make their own regulations. Agencies often try to cite their own administrative policies, procedures, and regulations as reasons why information cannot be provided to you. This is not proper. An administrative policy is not an exemption to FOIA. You can only withhold something if it falls under one of those 9 exemptions. So if they say, we have a rule that to get these records, you must pay a $30 fee and come in person with a money order made payable to Santa Claus, that's cute, but it's not in line with the law because the regulation cannot be stricter than the statute. And this is what we deal with all the time, where agencies try to claim that their personal rules are preventing you from access, which is just not how it works. So we live in a common law country, coming from the legal principles of England, where court decisions are based on prior court decisions. This is an opposite to civil law. So much of mainland Europe operates under the civil law system as kind of pioneered by Napoleon, and their court system isn't really as powerful as our court system is. So here, higher court decisions are binding to lower courts. The Supreme Court rules the law of the land. If the Supreme Court says FOIA doesn't exist, then it no longer exists because what they say by definition is the law. And I prefer this as a legal system, but people have different opinions. But basically, what it means is that we can review the case law to figure out the binding answers about if something is or is not public. And of course, this is really the work of what attorneys should be doing all day long. But we have to, on a more cursory level, understand the case law ourselves. And that's great because the Department of Justice publishes summaries on their website about how all the exemptions work. So even though there is only a 3-line exemption in the actual statute, there are pages and pages and pages of discussions that we can easily find, it should be in the syllabus, that explain exactly how the courts have interpreted these exemptions into what kind of specific material is and is not public record that we can then use when we make our FOIA requests. So what do we actually expect? So you make your request in writing to the agency, and perhaps the agency will deny your request. They'll provide some reasoning. It may or may not be legally sound. And then under the federal FOIA system, you have the option to submit an administrative appeal where you send them a letter saying you did this incorrectly for XYZ reasons. And then generally it goes to somebody higher up in the agency, hopefully an actual attorney, who will review what you said. And hopefully they will agree with you. And then they'll provide your records. Maybe you have to pay a bill or whatever. And then you'll get to the records. This often takes months, if not years. And it assumes that they actually do listen to what you had to say. Often you may submit your appeal and get nowhere. All the time I submit pages and pages of appeals and the government says, nope, we're denying you for reasons, sue us. And then unfortunately you have to sue them. And Reclaim the Record sues people all the time because they give us nonsensical denials. And then you have to go to court and you make a judge rule on if these records are or are not public, and this often takes years. Now, I'm not expecting any of you to be filing FOIA lawsuits, although I'd love it if you did. But I just want to get you guys familiar with the process in general. Generally speaking, for the records that I'm going to be advocating for you guys to be requesting on your own, this would not actually be necessary. Now, the biggest problem of FOIA for what we're talking about today is just backlogs. Agencies take forever. When I requested a 1,300-page FBI file, they said it would take 47 months to process it. I made a FOIA request to the State Department in 2017. I sued them in 2023 because they had not yet responded. USCIS takes years to process FOIA requests. It's about a 3-year backlog, 4 to 5 year backlog for most records. They're currently under court order for A files, which is luckily what most genealogists would want. So if there's an A file, you can possibly get those quickly, but only because somebody else sued them and has the court already yelling down their back to get them to process the A files as the law says. So now, the main exemption that we have to care about is the personal privacy exemption, B6. Generally speaking, we as genealogists want records about people, but personal privacy exemption exists specifically to protect people's information. So as a general rule, the way the case law stands today is that if someone is deceased, their records are no longer private. So I can't get anybody who's here, if you have records with the FBI for some investigation, if you were a criminal back in your earlier years, if you have an FBI file, I cannot get that. But if you were to pass away, then I could. Now, there might be other living people mentioned in the file where they have to go line by line and redact certain things. But if you're a dead person, your record is broadly disclosable under the current FOIA case law. Similarly, if someone was born more than 100 years ago, we can presume them to be deceased. This came out in an FBI case about 20 years ago. So if there's someone who you want to research who was born in 1921, we can assume they're dead. The agency is supposed to assume they're dead, and they can give you their records. And as much as I want everybody's records, this is understandable because we don't want every living person's information to be public. I kind of do, but I understand why as a society we don't want that. Now, how we as a society should decide exactly what is and is not public information is complicated. And we could have an hour-long discussion between us right now about how we set those standards. And many states have set different standards, and there's many kinds of records that are not public or become public in a long period of time because of a different standard. But under FOIA, for the records that are subject to FOIA, what I said goes: 100 years or they're deceased. And every agency has their own level of informal rules about how they will disclose information. So, for example, if I have a file with the government and there's a line in the file that says his sister Nicole, the agency might go line by line and redact the name of Nicole because they consider that private because she's a living person. The agency might not. It's all going to be dependent on how the FOIA processor is, how much they care, how anal retentive the agency is. There's always going to be a lot of variability in our responses. But broadly, any living person's information could potentially be redacted. And only a judge could really decide what or is not public under the law. So, for example, Social Security a couple of years ago made new rules. And they kind of go against the case law, which, until someone sues them about it, is going to be what their rule is, because the only recourse to an agency doing something is suing them, which is expensive. And of course, you could always lose, because if a judge says, actually, the case law is bad, I'm going to change it, then we worsen the case law for everybody. Did I freeze? No. Okay. So anyway, recently, the new rules say that if the person is less than 100 years old, they'll redact the parents' names unless you can provide proof of death for the parents as well, which is really upsetting because often we try to get these SS5s to get the parents' names. But we're kind of in this catch-22 where we have to prove the parents are dead if they want to give us if we want the parents' names in the first place, which defeats the point. And this is stupid and probably against the current case law. So if someone's born in 1927, that means their parents are obviously 120 years old, and we can infer they're dead, but Social Security refuses to. And until we sue them, that's the way it is. So it's just an unfortunate fact right now. And because there are 500 million fires burning in records access land, we haven't sued them yet. But I would hope that a judge would say that, no, that's stupid. Whereas there is a possibility that a dead person's parents could be alive, someone born in 1927 is not going to have living parents. You know, the oldest person on Earth right now was born in 1910 or 12 or so, I think. So there's no way that someone who's born in the 1920s has living parents. But that's for SSA to determine until we sue them. Okay, similarly, USCIS has A files. These are records of every alien who arrived after 1951, or sorry, after 1944, with some exceptions and some people that are also who came earlier. Just to, if you want to watch my Root Stack talk, learn all about A files. But it's records of immigrants is the short answer. And unless the individual is deceased, USCIS will not release a copy of this. But it's kind of dumb because at the same time, the underlying naturalization petition that's going to be included in the A file is a public court record. So you'll often find lots of just seemingly contradictory policies. So if I get a deceased person's A file, let's say someone immigrated in 1954, they naturalized in 1960, and they're now dead. Their 1960 naturalization petition at the court is a public record. Everybody who naturalized in court up until the 1990s, when it changed, has a public court record. However, the copy of the court record in the A file will get redacted. So USCIS will redact the name of everybody in the file and the petition who is not known to be deceased. So the person who naturalized, we already know is deceased because that's why I'm getting the file in the first place, but all their children could be alive. It could be somebody on this page, on this Zoom webinar right now. If your parents came in the 50s and naturalized in 1960, you as a child will be listed on the petition. It's a public record, but with the version that USCIS gives you, they're going to redact all the names, even though the name could be available online through a different source. And this is just the world of the government. It's stupid, but it is what it is. So here we have some examples of files from INS, which is now USCIS, And we see they've gone line by line to redact things under B6. They're saying that basically, the names and identifying information of witnesses in this case are not public because they could be alive. Now, this is a file from the 40s, so it's kind of ridiculous to say they could be alive, but that's the position this person took. Again, we have a questionnaire from the same file, and the subject named his sibling. And again, they've redacted this because they're considering it personally identifying information. Was this person's sibling likely to be alive? No. If I sued them, might I win? Maybe, but that's what happens. And the other kind of thing that matters is very similar. It's the law enforcement exemption. So many of the records that we want about our people's interaction with the government are related broadly to law enforcement. The FBI, anything about naturalization, it's all in the general law enforcement world. So sometimes agencies try and use this exemption very liberally. So the premise of the exemption is to exempt novel techniques and procedures, confidential informants, things like that. If the premise being, if the government admits that this is how they're tapping Russia's phones in 2025, it'd be a problem. What it does not apply to is investigation case files from 1937, where the novel technique and procedure was talking to the next door neighbor. But agencies sometimes attempt to exempt everything because it's generally law enforcement. The historic records that we are generally looking for should not ever have B7 law enforcement exemptions used, but the government sucks, so sometimes they do it anyway. Most of the time, they're full of it. Sometimes they will redact the names of law enforcement officers, which is similar to the privacy exemption, which is not as terrible. But other times they will redact entire pages, 5 pages, 10 pages, 30 pages, saying it's all law enforcement techniques, which is nonsense because these files are all old. Okay, so anyway, I just want to show you a quick case study with the Department of State. One of the coolest things that people can FOIA is passport applications. Now, I want to just say right now, you're not going to get them for years, but ignoring that, they're one of the coolest things. So passport applications from 1925 and prior are with the National Archives. These are online. They've been online for decades. But everybody who got a passport after 25 still has a passport with the State Department. And based on the case law, they will disclose any application for a passport if the person was born more than 100 years ago, or if the person is deceased. So I currently have hundreds of applications or passports on request that I'm waiting for. God knows when I'll hear back from them, but I will eventually get these files. And they have a website. They explain how to request them. You can do it by mail. They also have an email inbox they recently opened. So I requested John Denver's passport many years ago. He was born less than 100 years ago, so I supplied his proof of death. They accepted the request. I received a tracking number, and now it is in the long queue for passport requests that I'll eventually get. So here's an example of my great-grandparents' passport application. Clearly, it's a cool record with a lot of stuff on it. If you have relatives that traveled in the 20s, 30s, 40s, you'd want these passport records. But you must request them via FOIA and either wait a very long time or sue them. So we have Harry Brandenburg, born September 11th, 1894, married January 4th, 25. His father is Isaac, who died May 17th, 1933. He immigrated to the United States in 1888. We get his father's naturalization information. We get his the actual, Harry himself. We get his address. We get where they're going on the trip. They're traveling to England, Switzerland, and Italy, Holland, Belgium, and France. He includes his wife on the application. So that's Anna Brandenburg, born Johannesburg in 1905. We get the wife's maiden name, the wife's naturalization information because she was an immigrant. We get a physical description and, of course, a photograph. And some other fun stuff, too. On the left, there is a stamp that they saw Anna's naturalization certificate. So we get her certificate number, which could be used to get a file from USCIS if we wanted. Lots and lots of cool stuff on these records. And this is a pretty standard application. So if your people traveled with passports, they had passport applications. Now, I should say, in the 80s, the State Department illegally disposed of about half of them. So if you have US-born individuals who traveled in the mid-20th century, the odds of those surviving is much smaller because they decided they didn't want this stuff anymore and got rid of them, which was not legal, but they did it anyway, and it's the government, so nothing happens to them. But generally speaking, immigrants' files were kept. Which kind of the more interesting ones usually anyway. And that was kind of the entire thought process. Like US-born people renewing passports, it was kind of just not that interesting. The State Department didn't want to keep it around, but they didn't follow the proper procedure to reschedule it. They just destroyed it, which is not allowed. There is records laws about this stuff. But needless to say, until you request the file, you never actually know if it exists or not. Here we have a more modern file. Looks pretty similar. We have my grandmother's fourth husband, Dan. They do make a couple of redactions, but not a lot. We get the picture as information. It's all pretty cool. Honestly, the picture is usually the most exciting part of a passport. Every single passport has a photograph, and every single passport application has a photograph as well. So there's always going to be a picture to the extent it survives. Here we have my great-great-grandfather Giovanni's passport application. He was born in the 1870s in Italy. I have very few pictures of him, although it's funny because I just inherited my great-aunt's photo collection that I went through over the weekend, and I found about 12 more pictures of him, which is like triple the amount of pictures I've ever had of this guy for the last 20 years of me doing research. So this photograph is less exciting now because of these new pictures, but it has been exciting from 2008 when I started genealogy until last weekend when I had like 2 pictures of the guy. Now I have more. But anyway, as it turns out, my great-great-grandfather went back to Italy in 1950 to visit his sister. Or I assume to visit his sister. And there was a letter about what he was doing there, going back for the Holy Year in Rome. I'm going to take a guess that none of your ancestors are going to Rome for the Holy Year. But there are similar records for everybody, of course. And they're just very, very exciting records. Now, sometimes they don't exist. So here we have my denied FOIA request for Frederick Trump's passport application, who unfortunately was US born. So when they did this unlawful purging in the 80s, they destroyed his passport application as well. And they admitted this in their letter. The State Department has other kinds of cool records too. So anyone who's a US citizen that dies in a foreign country is supposed to have a CERTA, a consular report of death abroad. So a friend of mine asked me to get a CERTA for a cousin who died in 1991. Now, there's very little information online about how to get these records because there's basically no population making FOIA requests for CERTAs, but it's a government record and you can. And of course, because it's about a dead person, we can, there's no question the person is deceased. So they did this years ago, and I got it in about 2 months. It was amazing. They actually overnighted it to me via FedEx, which was not typical. Since COVID, that's all stopped. So now these things take years and years and years and years. But I got the record in about 2 months back in 2019, and it was wonderful. They made some redactions of living people's names, but broadly, I got the file. So it was Anna Pina, who died in Italy, but she was a US citizen. And we get all the information about her death in the file. Now, these reports are on Ancestry for anybody that died before 1970 something. But if you died post that cutoff, it's still at the State Department and you have to make a FOIA request. So USCIS, another federal agency with lots of historic genealogical records for us. So here we have my Uncle Alex's A file. This A file is hundreds of pages long, and it documents his entire life story. How he entered the US in 1960 on a visitor visa, found work, and stayed. And then 3 years later, he was arrested by INS because they came to his place of work and discovered that he was not lawful. And then there were dozens upon dozens of pages of stuff, and eventually he was able to get his status resolved. But anyway, we get lots of cool records in here, even from before his immigration. So starting in 1924, the US instituted a visa requirement. And for that, everybody had to go to a consulate and provide their birth and, if applicable, marriage records. And that all went to a visa file. And these exist through today. So we have my Uncle Alex's marriage record from Australia. They did B6 his wife's information because they didn't know if she was dead. I should have provided proof of death for both of them. And then they ostensibly would not redact the wife's information, although sometimes they just mess it up. They redacted, if we look on the left side of here, they redacted the parents' names, which again is stupid because Uncle Alex was born in 1932 and his parents are obviously deceased because they'd have been 120, 30 years old. I appealed it. And in the case of USCIS, they then unredacted the information for me. But every agency is a bit different with that information. We have his birth certificate. Again, they've redacted his parents' names, which is stupid. We have his tax return, which they've considered personally private information. Now, it's funny here because they are improperly using the exemption. Alex is dead. I got his file because I gave them proof of death. They should not be redacting his tax returns under the personal privacy exemption because he hasn't a right to privacy. However, IRS records under a separate statute are never to become public. So they should have redacted the schedule from the IRS under B3, the exemption that says that if a law says records aren't public, you can't have them. So in the end, the effect is the same, but they've improperly done it. Here we have an affidavit where they are referencing the other people in the family. Again, they've B6 this information because I have not given proof of death for some of these individuals. And that often gets very annoying. If you can show that these people are dead, they will give you the information. If you can't, if you don't know who it is in the first place, then it becomes a bit of a problem because you're in this similar doom loop where they've redacted some relative, but you don't even know who the relative is, so you can't give them proof of death. Sometimes they get very, very granular. They'll redact lots of things. But even with the redactions, these are still very, very interesting files because it documents the entire story of the immigration. Now, the later people immigrate, the more USCIS will have records for you. Go to my A-Files talk on RootsTech, you'll learn all about this. The average person who's Jewish is coming in the 1900s, 1910, 1920. They, if they have A-Files, would only be because they never naturalized, and the file would likely not be that lengthy. 5, 10, 20 pages, maybe at best. If you're coming in the 50s or 60s or 70s, your A-Files could be dozens of pages long. If there's immigration problems like Uncle Alex, they could be hundreds of pages long. Generally speaking, the only Jews that are coming in that time frame are probably coming from Israel. But if you have cousins or even your own family that may have come from Israel in that post-war era, there could be very, very, very lengthy A-Files. As it turns out, Uncle Alex was legalized via a private bill. So he basically petitioned Congress, and Congress passed the law that says, well, forgive Alex this time for coming here illegally. And that's what happened. That's all in the A-file. Okay, here we have examples where they've redacted pages in their entirety because they said that another agency has to look at them first. So sometimes you'll get FOIA responses where you'll get 10 pages, and then 3 pages will be referred to the FBI, referred to ICE, referred to NARA, because although the agency has the record, they consider the actual underlying owner of some subset to be some other agency. And now they send it to the other agency. And then in 6 months, you get a package from them saying, we finally reviewed it all. Here's your pages. So sometimes I just get random packages from the FBI that I'm not expecting because a year and a half earlier, some other agency referred 3 pages to the FBI. And you get the idea. Here's an example where USCIS withheld an entire page under B3. Which is the law that says if a statute exists preventing access, they don't give you anything. There are laws on the books that say that State Department visa records never become public. So that's probably what this is. It's probably a State Department record. And sure enough, in the letter, they actually said that specifically. So in the response letter, they should explain to you what statutes are being invoked. And in this case, it's section 1202F of the INA, which makes visa records from the State Department never public to anybody. Here we have another page where they cited B7. Again, they've used the law enforcement exemption to hide certain information from Uncle Alex's file. Obviously, the specifics of Uncle Alex's file does not matter to you guys, but understand that these are the kinds of exemptions that'll be invoked. They may redact an entire page. They may redact a word. They may redact every other line. It just depends on what the processor feels like doing that day and what the agency's instructions to that processor are. And they're going to just differ all the time. And lo and behold, here's my letter from the FBI that I got a year and a half later saying, we have finally gone through your stuff and we've given you nothing. This is all exempt. So the 3 pages that were referred to the FBI said were entirely non-public information, which is probably wrong. But I didn't sue them, so I'll never get it. Now, I quickly added a section about P-file to this talk. So P-files are the working files of the naturalization examiner. And they were created by INS from the 1920s to 1950. And they're really the predecessor of A-files. And they're not really well known about. USCIS does not advertise them. There's only a handful of people on Earth that know how to request them, because you must cite a specific file by the exact box and accession and records holding center facility information. But if anybody here has people that naturalized in the late 20s, 30s, or 40s, email me, and I can request this P-file for you. The P-files have much more information than the naturalization petition itself has, because it has the underlying questionnaires that were asked and all of the naturalization examiner's notes. So these are often whereas a naturalization petition is often 2 pages long, 3 pages long, these files are often 10 or 20 pages long. If you're an enemy alien, they're really long. In the case of people here, that mostly be the German immigrants, I guess, but most of my research is Italian. The Italian P-files are often 100 pages long. Sometimes they shove other stuff in there. So in 1950, this woman asked for a replacement certificate because she lost her certificate of citizenship. They gave her a new one. This stuff should not have been put in the P-file because the P-files were the working records of the petition process. But sometimes the offices just got lazy and threw things in there. Again, we could spend hours discussing P-files, but I just want to mention briefly that if you have people that naturalize in the 30s and 40s, please let me know, and I can request these files for you, and we'll get them in God knows how many years. Now, as I was preparing this, the reason I added this on at the last minute was because I had a thought that I could probably request a P-file for somebody in my cousin Aaron Clapman's family. So somebody in this talk will probably recognize what we're looking at here. Here is the naturalization petition that I just pulled up before we started the presentation of my great-great-grandfather Solomon's second cousin's wife, Lena Clapman. And Lena Clapman naturalized in 1930 in Chicago, 1931 in Chicago. This record is on Ancestry. So this would not be hard to find. However, there is an underlying P-file to this Lena Clapman's naturalization, because there's a whole naturalization examiner system that was in place at this time, and there's going to be a 5 to 10 page file with USCIS about Lena from her naturalization that documents the entire process. So, for example, it might ask, what is your mother's maiden name? It'll have things that the petition does not have. So I'm going to make a request for this file, and we'll get it in 2 years or so. But if anybody else has files that you'd like as well, please just send me the petition, and I can make this request for you, and we'll get them at some point. They start in the mid to late 20s and go to 1950. Anyway, I want to show some other records that you can get via FOIA quickly. We can spend an hour on each of these, but just familiarize yourself broadly. This is from a VA claims file. So for the first time since I've given this talk, there's actually a way to get VA claims files easily, because Reclaim the Records just created a new website called birls.org. That's BIRLS.org. It is a way to search the VA's database of veterans files and then make FOIA requests for the veterans files. But long story short, if a veteran served in the military between 1910 and the present, they probably have a file with the VA, and this file could be hundreds of pages long. Up until recently, there was not really any way for genealogists to get access to these records. This has changed for a couple of reasons, but long story short, any veteran in your family, World War I, World War II, Korea, career, whatever, there's probably a claims file, and you'd want to request that via FOIA, because it will likely be an amazing file. Similarly, here's an FBI file. So if your relative was involved in any criminal proceedings or investigations, the FBI had files. Now, unlike a lot of this stuff, the FBI is really good, so to speak, with destroying things. There's a very detailed record schedule, and all kinds of files are kept on a certain schedule. So depending on the kind of crime, either everything might be kept, maybe everything's kept for 20 years, they might sample one of every 10 files. So what survives from the FBI is really haphazard. There is a reasoning to it, but it's not really navigable to the average genealogist. I could never tell you, for example, what survives regarding, drug trafficking FBI files in the 1930s. There is an answer to what would be kept for that kind of category, but I don't know what it is. But anybody can make an FBI request to the a FOIA request to the FBI for any surviving case files on a given person, and maybe they'll get lucky and get something. So here was a mobster great-grandparent of a client from a couple years back, where they were doing all this racketeering stuff in the 60s, and there were about 50 pages that survived, and they were really cool. And I was able to get these via FOIA. We are all familiar with the draft cards. Draft cards, up until 1960, are with NARA. So the World War I, World War II draft cards are online. If you want a Korea era draft card, you can order from the National Archives. They're at the National Archives in St. Louis. They're public records. However, if someone was born after 1960, their selective service cards are still with the selective service system. If the person is deceased, you can FOIA their selective service card. For that matter, anybody here could also get their own selective service card if they have one. If they were born before 1960, it'd be at NARA. After 60 would be at the selective service. So here we have Kurt Cobain's. He's widely known to be deceased, so I had the idea to try to FOIA his card, and I was able to get it. So here we have the card he signed. We have his date of birth, his social, his address, his signature, his phone number. Honestly, this is just more for fun than anything else. But if you're researching someone particularly recent, you could get this file under FOIA if and only if they're deceased. Sometimes, and this is less common for what we're going to be talking about here, but it could happen, an agency will neither confirm nor deny that a record exists. It's called getting glomarred, which comes from a lawsuit about a CIA vessel and a FOIA response, and the ship was called the Global Marine. But needless to say, that sometimes happens, and it is legal. It's generally a national security thing, but it could happen for privacy reasons as well. So just be aware that that is a thing in FOIA world. Okay, so I want to quickly discuss state-level requests, because as much as FOIA is the federal government, there are state-level records that we might want as well. So every state has their own version of FOIA. There's different rules, different timelines, different fees, different appeal options, different exemptions, but it's the same premise. You ask for records, the government either gives them to you or says why they're not going to give them to you. If you disagree, you sue them. So whenever you research in a certain state, you have to figure out who's entitled to make the request. Some states like Virginia require that you have to be a citizen of the state. Is there a mandated response time? In Illinois, they have 5 days to respond. In Florida, there is no response time under the law. So if they take 7 years, that's your problem. What are the exemptions? Is there a fee structure? How do you appeal? Can you win back attorney's fees? These are all things that would be covered under the various laws of the state. And you have to basically read the law. So there's tons of state-level records you might get. And I think I have a UPS package here, which if I don't answer it, it's going to have my doorbell ringing. So I'm really sorry. Hold on. And of course, as I did it, the guy left, which means it probably was just a wrong delivery in the first place. Sorry about that. And now the stupid thing is ringing. Okay. Anyway, so here we have a burial permit. And these are my great-great-grandparents who were buried out on Long Island. They died in New York City. Burial permits are often cool to get because if you don't know where someone's death certificate is filed, but you know where they're buried, you can get the burial permit from the place of burial, and that would potentially lead you to the death certificate location. So Peter and Maria died in New York City, which I did already know that. But if I didn't, if I knew they were buried in St. Charles out in Babylon, I could get the burial permit from Babylon, and that would lead me to confirm where they died because the burial permit would say so. So again, the forms differ throughout the years. They never have parents' names, unfortunately, at least in New York, but they do have lots of other information about the decedent. In the last couple of years, New York State has kind of cracked down on giving out access to these because the health department has insisted it's not subject to FOIA. I disagree with that. It's a bit complicated, but in theory, these are the kinds of records one could potentially FOIL in New York. There's licensing records. So the New York State Department of Education has the occupational licensing records for tons of people going back a long time. So Benjamin Zone was a doctor in the early 1900s. He still has paperwork on file with the Education Department. If you're a civil servant, there could be records with the various employment organizations. This guy worked for New York City as an assessor, and they did have records of his employment. If you are a voter, there are often voter registration records. Now, the voter registration laws are different in every state, but in New York, they're public records. So anyone can FOIL anyone's voter registration record, regardless if the person is alive or deceased. Now, how they will respond to the request is going to depend on how much the particular Board of Elections sucks or not. My mileage is certainly varied, but under the law, they're all public records. In New York State, in 1956, we shifted over to what we're called the buff card system, where when you moved, you registered to vote, and then your registration was active until you moved again. So everybody would have one card for every address, which you're looking at right here. Before 56, we had annual registration, where every single year you had to register to vote. Now, the the Manhattan election registers just went on Ancestry 2 weeks ago. So if you had family in Manhattan in the 19-teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, or 50s, these voter books are now on Ancestry. But for everywhere else, they're not. So I had to make a FOIL request to the Brooklyn Board of Elections for this one you're looking at right here. And I was able to get the registration for my great-great-grandfather, Joseph Mondello. And it gets his party enrollment, his name, his address, his political affiliation, his occupation, where he works, where he lives, blah, 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 blah. And most interestingly, in New York, voter registration forms, both this one and the buff card, ask for your immigration and your naturalization information. So here we have Claire Allison's card from the 60s, I think, 57. And at the bottom, it says that she naturalized on July 13th, 1933 in the New York State Supreme Court, certificate number 3666782. And we can get this naturalization information from these voter registration cards. Just last week, I'm going to call out Emily Garber. Emily Garber, who many of you may know, found her ancestors' voter record in the New York County voter records on Ancestry. And it confirmed that her grandfather or great-grandfather naturalized in a random court upstate New York in the 1890s. And she'd never found it before because she had no idea the guy had ever lived there. I believe it was Washington County. And because it was in the voter record, she was able to figure this out. Now, of course, that's on Ancestry. There's no FOIA request required. But for records that are not on Ancestry, which is basically everywhere else besides New York County, you'd have to make a FOIA request. Now, what I do with most my Reclaim the Records work is large-scale requests. And I support everybody trying to do this, but it's much more complicated. So, for example, in New Jersey, I made an OPRA request, the Open Public Records Act. It's their version of FOIA. And I asked the Hudson County clerk for their scanned database of all naturalization records. Because I heard through the grapevine that Hudson County had scanned their entire naturalization petition collection. And they gave it to me. So I paid nothing, and they mailed me a hard drive of hundreds of thousands of naturalization petitions with an index listing everybody's name and date and file number, and then the images themselves. So now I have every single Hudson County naturalization that ever happened. In theory, Reclaim the Records will put this online one day in our big backlog of projects to work on. But because it's so much data, it's kind of just hard to deal with that. But in theory, if you have a Hudson County person, I can get you a naturalization record. And this is all because I made an OPRA request. At the same time, I made the exact same request to Bergen County, and they told me to screw off. So Reclaim the Records actually just sued Bergen County because we want all of Bergen County's naturalization records. And hopefully we're going to get those one day. So these large-scale requests operate the same way. We ask for records, they either deny me or they give it to me or they don't because of backlogs or exemptions or whatever. And then we fight about it. But it's the exact same process, just more convoluted because it's more data. Even when people deny you, it's often still interesting. So in New Jersey specifically, there is a government records council. Again, every state has different appeal options. So it's going to, how successful this will be will depend on the jurisdiction. But in New Jersey, I go to this council whenever I get denied. And after that, the agency has to submit a sworn affidavit where they explain why it was denied. Because often when you just get the rate, like the level 1 denial is often gibberish. It's just some clerk going, you can't have the records because, they're expensive, blah, 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 blah. But like there's zero legal analysis. When you get to the appeal stage and you have real lawyers working on things, you often can get useful responses. Now, obviously, it's much more useful to have the records, but if you're trying to learn about the records or learn about the government agency or how the operations work, you can even learn stuff from these denials. So in this case, I had asked the New Jersey Health Department for all their instruction manuals for how they process requests, because I was having issues trying to order vital records, getting stupid responses. They couldn't find things. They wouldn't do it this way. They take a long time. And I was trying to understand how the actual internal processes of the DOH Vital Records Office work. Well, it turns out they don't have any procedures. And the reason they denied me was because they have 0 written down policies. And whenever someone starts to work there, they assign them a buddy. And the buddy who's been there longer teaches the new people what to do. And this is in a sworn certification from the registrar of the office. So as much as they didn't really give me an instruction manual, I'm still learning about how the office operated. And there was a marginal benefit to that. Now, I know we're coming on the hour, but I have a few more slides just to broadly discuss other uses of FOIA laws. Obviously, the idea for the most part is we want to get records, but we can also use FOIA laws in other ways. And this really goes more into the lines of what Reclaim the Records does, but you all could do it too. There are many records that are available, but inconveniently. And it's possible that we could use FOIA laws to get around that. So Reclaim the Records was created because the New York City Archives had their marriage license indexes only available on microfilm in the reading room. And we, and of course we didn't exist yet, but Brooke Gans, who formed Reclaim the Records, as an individual, wanted to pay the archives to copy the microfilm so she could have copies for herself and then put them online, which the archives did not do. They said no, and she had to sue them, and of course she won, because records at an archive are public records, and they have no right to say we can't give you copies. So we were able to put them online. That way everybody can search them instantaneously instead of having to fly to New York to look at them. So even though the records were available if you flew to New York, we were able to use FOIA to make them available more conveniently. Sometimes the archives only have records in clunky formats. Sometimes, and this is similar to the situation that we were talking about just now, where if the agency, they'll only make records available in a really clunky way. They have a database, but they don't make the database available. They just have a printed out, spreadsheet in a binder. The law generally requires them to give you records in the format they have them. So if I want this binder as a spreadsheet, I can make a FOIA request and I say, give me this database as an Excel spreadsheet. And usually they would have to do that. Every state's going to be a bit different, but as a general matter, you could do things like that. And that way you would have the actual database file to work with yourself. Sometimes agencies don't allow you to make photography of records. This is, again, generally not really parallel with FOIA. If a record is public, they really can't have restrictions on them. So it's either disclosable and you can't access it at all, or it's a public record and you can inspect it, you can copy it, you can make photos of it, you can scan it, whatever. And you can use FOIA laws to combat some of these rules. I had a situation once where someone came to me at Roots Tech 5 years ago because they were very alarmed that when they went to the Virginia archives, they were forced to sign a user agreement that said they would not publish or distribute the material that they reproduced. And this was very upsetting to the person because they were getting copies of 18th century deeds and they wanted to put them on their ancestry tree. But as per the agreement they were forced to sign, they could not do that. Well, public records laws would generally say that you can't assert, the state can't assert copyright over 18th century deeds. So what did I do? I wrote to the Virginia Attorney General's office and I explained the issue. And sure enough, like 4 months later, I heard back from somebody and they were working on it. And the library agreed to rewrite their user agreement because it was against the law. They did not have the authority to force people to not publish public records. So the AG's office actually came to bat for us and the agreement was changed. Now, of course, there are some restrictions. There are some laws about some things, like if you're using stuff for commercial purposes, that could cause some restrictions. But generally, an agency cannot restrict an ability to disseminate a record. And that is my hour on how public records work.
Alec, thank you so much. It's amazing, amazing, amazing. And I really liked how you fit in my family on the slide there. Thank you, Lizzie. Did you catch that Clapman on there? It was good. My sister came in
I
today.
did, but I never knew Uncle Si's name was Joel.
Yeah,
What?
well, when he comes over here, you
Yeah,
got his
one of
own
my
resume.
uncles had a different first name. It was very cool. Thank you. We'll have to look
Oh.
into it.
Yeah. So the P files are a project that I've been working on for the last couple of years, and they're not really well understood properly. But long story short, I'm going to request your mother's P file, which I will get eventually. But if
And
anybody
you know
else
what,
has people,
Alec, I just want to say something. That Lena that you talked about, that has been my roadblock in my research.
really,
That Lena, I cannot go back past her parents, and that's the hardest person I have my tree. I wanted to say one thing to Suzanne Hoffman. You said that your father lived in Sarasota. He actually gave a program for the JGS of Southwest Florida. He was a doctor who talked about diseases that were prevalent in Jewish ancestry.
Yep, and I have a whole talk on that.
Okay.
But I didn't know my father had actually given it.
And that's probably, remember, Jim had said, I recognize the name.
Yeah.
It's probably where he recognized it because we have a list of all our programs on the website. And if you go to our website, you'll see exactly which month and year he spoke.
Oh, that's kind of cool. Yeah, he was affiliated with the senior center in Sarasota and also the temple and an AIDS clinic that was down there.
Very good.
Alec,
yeah.
with the new federal administration and what you've just described, it sounds like there's no time obligation for the most part in these federal agencies to produce. And I was just wondering, with anticipated staff shortages that we're hearing about constantly, is there any recourse for just the issue of time?
So technically, I kind of realized I didn't even say this because it's such a pretend deadline. Technically, under the federal FOIA, they have 20 business days to respond, and they can invoke an extra 10 days if they cite like pressing circumstances. So functionally speaking, an agency must respond in about 6 weeks. However, that never happens. And technically, on 31 business days, I can march into court and sue them. And a judge would say you've broken the law. But this goes largely unenforced. Like FOIA backlogs have been months, if not years, everywhere for all time. So I honestly think that FOIA backlogs will not be noticeably different under Trump than they were under Biden or Trump 1, only because the law is so broken in the first place that, like, there are records that I requested under Trump 1 from the State Department that I have not received since 2020 in the ensuing entire next administration. There's a decent chance, even if Trump was not president, I would not have received them in the next 4 years because I was probably only going to get them if I sued the agency in the first place. So I'm sure we'll be able to eventually find examples where there's a specific purge that impacts things. There was a big thing in FOIA news a couple of weeks ago where apparently the entire privacy staff at OPM got fired. So CNN was trying to make a FOIA request to OPM, and the person was like, yeah, good luck, there's no one left here. If that happens, then yeah, obviously there'll be no FOIA processing anymore. I think the bureaucracy is just so terrible already that if the agency needs 1,000 FOIA processors to comply with the law and they have 50, even if they lose 20 of them, they have 30 now, we're already so behind anyway that you are not going to notice it. Now, I, as the lunatic with 500 pending requests, tracking things where every single day I'm noticing changes, maybe I would say, oh, well, USCIS was taking 7 months, now they're taking 8 months. But to the average person, you're never going to be able to perceive a difference just because it's so bleak by default.
As a little follow-up to that, if you are successful, there is no reimbursement to you of any incurred costs?
So under federal FOIA, fee recovery is definitely possible, but it's not always guaranteed when you're acting as an individual. So like when Reclaim the Records is a nonprofit, does a lawsuit. If we win, we're supposed to get our fees back. If I, Alec, as a professional genealogist, do it, I'm not going to get my fees back because I am operating as my business. If you, as a sole person, sue the government for a file, I think it's a little iffier. I think there's a decent chance of fee recovery if you're just operating under your own interest. Me as a professional is a bit shakier. But I believe you would get your fees if you sue and win. Honestly, what happens with most FOIA cases in situations like this is you don't really go to trial. Like the U.S. attorney yells at the agency. They say, give her the 7 pages they asked for. They give you the 7 pages, and then you negotiate on fees and you call it a day. When it's like really, if you decide tomorrow to become Reclaim the Records 2 and make really complex FOIA requests and sue about it, you're going to be in litigation territory where you're actually briefing and fighting about it. For I want grandma's passport record, and the only issue is you've not responded, it's not going to go to summary judgment. They're going to just give you the file. And then you can usually negotiate for fees.
Alec, you on your Hudson County big bonanza, how many records were involved?
So on the spreadsheet, on the screenshot that I showed you, there were 108,000 lines, but I'm pretty sure that I have like 200 or 300 something thousand. I'll open it up right now and look.
Wow. And you said, I think you said they gave them to you on a hard drive. Was it literally a
yeah, they mailed me an external.
Wow.
Which, normally they're supposed to charge me for the cost of reproduction. So they would normally say, give us $50 for the hard drive, we'll give you the stuff. They didn't even bother. So I got a free hard drive out of it. I got a free hard drive and the records. Okay, there's 207,000 names on the spreadsheet. Do you have Hudson County relatives?
No.
Okay. Anyone who asks me, I have sent out the stuff, but it's just, very bulky. And most people don't have Hudson County stuff, so they don't care. Lori asked in the chat about voter registration records, about how far back they go. So in New York, obviously every state's going to be different. The buff cards with that no longer having annual registration starts in 57. I'm pretty sure it's in 56, but it's wrong in 57. The annual registration ends in 56, and it goes back. So the records on Ancestry go back to 1915 for New York County, but I believe there had been records going back to at least like the 1880s, because I've seen indexes of these records going back that far. What survives is a bit spotty. And of course, every county has their own records. So it's all going to depend on what was kept for the county. Voter records in New York are permanent. So nothing should ever be destroyed. But for example, all the Bronx records got flooded in Hurricane Sandy. So if you want Bronx voter records, you're out of luck. Of course, most of what I want is from the Bronx. But definitely early 1900s, they should exist. Maybe late 1800s.
Any other questions? I just wanted everybody to know we're going to be posting your handout on the website, but I think I went ahead and emailed it to everybody that's here, and we'll put the recording on the website for at least a month, if that's okay, Alec?
Yeah, of course.
And there were several people who couldn't come, who wanted to come, so they'll be able to hear your presentation. Thank you.
Alec,
Any other questions, Larry?
Alec, I assume that when you say they sent you the records on a hard drive, you're talking about a thumb drive.
No, because it was such a large database, it was actually an external hard drive, like a real external hard drive.
Goodness.
Because it was like, it was like a terabyte or something. I forget how big it was, but it was a lot of data. Many agencies still send CD-ROMs out. So I actually have a disk drive right here on my desk because I'm getting CD-ROMs from the government weekly. The VA sends things on CD-ROMs. USCIS sends things on CD-ROMs or DVDs. Okay, Lori asked, might a union activist in the 20s have an FBI file? Certainly. So the proper answer is go to the records retention schedule for the FBI, figure out what classification would cover union activity, see what the retention is. But honestly, it's so complicated, it's not worth it. And the answer is you make a FOIA request to the FBI. There's a portal. It's like the DOJ has their own little FOIA portal, something FOIA star or something. And you can request the specific individual's case file from the FBI via that portal. And you have to give their date of birth, their full name, proof of death, if you have it, ideally. And they'll do a search and come back to you. Usually they're going to say they have nothing, but I get stuff occasionally.
Any other questions? Anything else in the chat? I think people answered some of the others. Somebody asked actually about what does on wells mean, but we got answers on that. Alec, this is amazing. You're a wonderful speaker. I thank you so much for coming. If anybody wants to stay on, we could turn off the recording. If anybody has a question they don't want recorded. So Jim, if you could turn off the recording, maybe somebody might want to ask a question and not be recorded.